Now that we have our hero section all built, we will move on to creating the dialog for the Contact Me button. We'll be using an HTML form and standard CSS and JavaScript to make this happen. The first thing we'll do is find an example HTML dialog to reference while we're building our dialog. So let's go to Google and just search for HTML dialog. And in this case, there is a W3 Schools example, so I'll look at that real quick. And in this case, it's using the dialog HTML element with open to open the dialog. And that works pretty well. See, the dialog window's open there. And if I remove the open attribute and run it, the dialog goes away. Now that works fine, and you can go down that path if you want. I actually, in this case, prefer the Mozilla example, so we're going to use that, and I'll show you why. If you scroll back up, the first result is the mozilla.org example. And in this case, they have an advanced example down here that uses the show modal function off of the HTML element that you grab in JavaScript. And for our purposes, that works a little bit better. So we're gonna use this example. So as you can see here in the HTML, we need to first create a dialog element, and we need to have a button that shows that dialog right here. And then on the back end, they're adding the event listener for the show button in JavaScript. We'll add ours in HTML. I think that looks a little nicer. But then we call the show modal on the dialog there. So that's the general approach we're going to take. So let's minimize that window, go to our Visual Studio Code, and here's our portfolio site project that we've been working on. And we are going to create a new Lightning Web component. And we will call this the Contact Me button. Okay. So like we saw in the example, the first things we need are a dialog element. It's not picking it up as a HTML element automatically. There we go. There's our dialog element. And let's put something in here just to demonstrate the opening and closing the dialog. So if I put an H1 in here, it says contact me. And then outside of it, we need a button that will open and close the dialog, or open the dialog. So we're going to say button. And what did our example do? Our example gave it an ID, which we don't want to use IDs in Lightning Web development. Okay, so we'll just put contact me as the text, and we will add the JavaScript handler to it. So we'll say contact. Okay. So on click, we will assign it a JavaScript function that we haven't created yet. We'll say show dialog. And then we'll go into our JavaScript file. And we will need to do two things here. First, we will need to get the HTML element that represents the dialog so that we can call the show and close on it. And we'll also need to create the button handler. So the show dialog button handler right here. So we'll do show dialog. Let's see, what was I doing here? Show dialog, just like that. And we don't have anything to call yet, so we're gonna get the the dialog element from the HTML, but we need to do that in the rendered callback handler. So Salesforce will call this rendered callback once all of the HTML elements have been rendered on the page. So in this case, we need to ask it for, we need to put the HTML element for the dialog into a JavaScript variable. So we will create a JavaScript variable up here and call it dialog. And then we will assign that variable, I cannot spell, dialog, using the templates query selector. And we will need to give our dialog a class name for this to work. So let's go back to our dialog and say class. We'll call it contact dialog. And because it's a class, we need the dot in front of it, just like a CSS selector. Okay, so we should now, when this page loads up, we should get a variable that has the dialog in it. And we can use that variable to open our dialog. And we use the function called show modal. A modal is a specific type of dialog. It means you can't click off of it. It dominates the focus of that page for that moment. You can't do anything else while the modal is up. Modeless would be you can click around behind it and move the dialog around and all of that. In this case, we want the user to focus just on this dialog and dismiss it if they don't want to interact with it anymore. So we're going to say dialog show modal. Okay, so at that point, we should have something we can test. So let's see if we can preview this contact me button in our local LWC environment. And that should show up in our browser here. Just a moment. Okay, so there's our button. So far so good. Now let's go ahead and click this button and see if it does anything. And it does not. So something went wrong. So the first thing to do if something goes wrong is to open up your dev tools. So hit F12. And here in Chrome, that opens up your dev tools. And let's scroll up to the top. These are normal LWC local server errors. But here, this uncaught type error, it says this .template query selector is not a function. So it's in the rendered callback function that we just created in the contact me button. It's saying template.querySelector is not a function. So let's go back and look at our Visual Studio Code, which I'll just click on the icon. I got too many things going on here. Yes, so query selector, it's case sensitive. So I am using a capital Q. So let's lowercase that, save it, and open up our local development server one more time. Let's close our dev tools. And there we go. So now we have the dialog that pops up. Now it's only a box that has the H1 contact me in it. And currently there's no way to get rid of it other than hitting escape. So I can do contact me, hit escape, and it goes away, but that's all it does. So one basic thing we'd like to be able to do is have a cancel button that makes the dialog go away. So let's go back and take care of that. So let's start with the HTML. I'm gonna close the side panel here, giving me some more real estate. Let's go to the HTML, and in the dialog, I'm going to add a button. I'm going to call it cancel. And on the click handler, so on click, I'm going to map it to a JavaScript function called close dialog. So let's go back to the JavaScript and create the close dialog function. And since we already have the dialog variable, we will say, what is our example? Let's go back to, refer back to our Mozilla example here. The JavaScript they use is not show modal, just simply the close function. We don't need to set the value here. We're not using the value in the launching dialog or the launching button or anything like that. So we can just say dialog.close. Dialog.close. Okay, so we have the JavaScript function and we have it mapped in HTML to the proper handler. I did not need that. I don't know why I did that. Show dialog, oh, close dialog. Okay, so let's save that. And let's go back to our preview. And if I hit contact me, now there's a cancel button in the middle of the dialog. I should be able to click that and it closes the dialog. Great. So one step down. Okay, so the next thing, because this is a contact dialog, we're going to have a form within that dialog. So I think the order I prefer, we know we're going to use an Apex controller to actually create a lead when the user submits this form. So I like to create the Apex controller and the submission method first so that I know what to target in the JavaScript. So in that case, let's open up our Visual Studio Code one more time, and let's go to classes and say create Apex class. And we're going to call this contact me button controller. Well, let's leave the button out of it. It actually has nothing to do with the button itself. We'll say contact me controller. Okay, so here we are with a new Apex class, and let's change this to global. And let's get rid of this constructor since we're not going to do anything in the constructor. We need just a method that that takes the first name, last name, the company name, and the email of who is trying to contact us, and a description of why they are contacting us. So let's start off with public static void, and we're going to say create lead, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to turn around and create a Salesforce lead, and we'll say capital S, first name, string last name, and let's wrap this around because we got a small screen size here. Oh, we got all kinds of stuff going on. Now it really wants to help me out with whatever this is right here. Sometimes IntelliSense fights you more than it helps you. Okay, last name. Nope, it really doesn't want me to do that. So I'm going to break its sensors. And we'll put this on the next line. We'll say string company, string email, and string description. Just like that. Only got a little bit of cut off with my head there, looks like. Okay. So That bracket's going to drive me nuts. So within this, we need to write the apex to create. That tabbing is out of control. You need to write the apex to create a lead. So the first thing you do is lead. Let's make a new lead. And then we will set all of the properties of this lead. First name, last name, lead company, and then the email. A little bit tedious. We'll get there. And then once we have all of those items set, we will just insert that lead. And there we go. So we have an Apex controller for submitting our lead. Now let's go back and create the HTML form to collect that information that we'll send to this controller eventually. So let's go back to the HTML for the Contact Me button. And inside this dialog class, between the header and the cancel button, let's create a form. And we're not going to set the action. We're not doing a straight get put HTTP action on that, so we're not going to set that right now. Okay, so in the form, we need the first name, so we need an input. Well, let's do it the proper way, and let's do labels. So we're going to have a label, and inside each label, we're going to have an input. So we also know we're going to need, let's see, how many inputs? We need 4 inputs, right? So if you look at the Apex class, we have input for first name, input for last name, input for company, input for email. And this description, we'll make this a text area to encourage a little bit more verbose description. So we need 4 text inputs. Now, in Visual Studio Code, you can use Emmet to create a series of HTML tags. I won't go through a ton of that right now, but I just want to explain what I'm going to do right here. I'm going to say I want 4 labels, so label times 4. And inside each of those labels, I want an input element. So that created me 4 labels with nested inputs. Unfortunately, it didn't format them very nicely, but it did create them. Actually, I think now let's do it the verbose way. We don't have a lot of screen size, so let's keep it like this. Okay. So this label will be for first name, and for the input, we're going to give that a name of first name. That will link up the input text box with the label that identifies it. And it is a text type, so we're good there. And then we're going to say last name. Give it a name of last name. Label for the next one is going to be company. And the last one will be the email. Now in this case, HTML has an email type, so we're going to change this text type to email. Okay, and then one last element in here is going to be the text area for the description. And we're going to call that, well, we don't have a label for that. Let's put a placeholder in this one instead. So we don't need to assign it an ID, but let's put some placeholder text to identify it rather than a label. Say, what would you like to talk about? And as far as the rows and columns, 10 rows is a bit much. Let's give them 4 to start with. And let's expand that to 40 columns. Columns would be the amount of characters that the box is, and the rows would be the number of rows, the number of lines. Okay, so now that we've got that form, let's go look and see what that looks like in our local development environment. Ooh, that is pretty ugly, huh? So it's got all of the the inputs, but they're all in a line. You can see there are text areas here. So that's pretty ugly. Let's clean that up a little bit before we move on, just because I don't think we can handle that. All right, so the first thing we need to do is add a CSS file to our component. So if we go here and we add a new file in the Contact Me button folder, we need the Contact Me button.css. In the CSS for our Contact Me button, let's do a couple things. First, let's get rid of the side panel, move to the side, and then so we want to be able to see the updates as we make them. So if you open the Contact Me button as it is now, or the contact form as it is now, it's this jumbled mess, right? So the most important thing, we want all of our labels and text boxes to each be on their own line. So this is a mess where it's trying to get as many of the elements on one row as possible. But we want each element to be on its own line. So in order to do that, maybe like a simple brute force way would be to say, let's select the form, and we'll say every element in the form, give it a display of block. So that will pretty much put every element on its own line. So if I save that, we have to click the button again. Now each element is on its own line. One problem we have is we have no text in our labels, so let's go fix that as well. We just put the label text right here. So first name, last name, company, and email. So if we save that, open up our Contact Me again, we have so we have a problem here. This points out the issue with the CSS selector I just used. So the problem here is we want each our labels to also be on their own line. And I just selected, with this CSS, I selected all of the child elements of the form. That only goes to one level of child. The text input boxes are 2 levels down. So they're nested within the label, which is also then nested within the form. So this selector won't exactly work. So let's do a different selection. Let's get rid of that. And let's say for labels input and text area, display block or display block. So that will grab all of these 3 different element types and put the display block on them. And there we go. That's more what we want. We want the labels to be above each of the elements. Okay, so we'll come back to styling this a little bit more later, but at least this is semi-sane for the moment. The next step is to handle the submission of the form. So if we go back to our HTML, the form will be handling the submit, but we need a submit button. Let's move our button within the form. So we have a cancel button right now. So let's get that underneath the text area here. But we also want a submit button. So in this case, we can say input type submit. And if we just save that and let our development environment reload, our server reload, we now see there's a submit button there, submit and cancel. But currently it doesn't do anything. It just submits the form and nothing happens. So let's go to the form and then assign an onSubmit handler. And we're going to create a JavaScript function for this. Let's see, we should call it, let's call it handle submit. Just like that. Now, if we go to the JavaScript for our button or for our Lightning Web Component, we can create a handle submit function. Now, in this function, you saw that when I click the submit buttons will automatically submit the form to whatever action you've set, but we haven't set an action, so it just submits the form to nowhere and goes away. We want to override this behavior. So what you can do is you can put an event in here. So by default, the framework sends an event through to this onSubmit call. And this event has a method on it, or a function on it, that says don't do what you normally do. So we can say event.preventDefault. And what this prevent default does is it keeps the form from submitting automatically. So save that and then hit the contact me button. If I go click submit, nothing happens now. It doesn't have the built-in submission. So now we can add our own custom logic inside this function to call the Apex controller. So let's do that now. So if you recall, the Apex controller up here, contact me controller, has a create lead function, which we actually need to decorate with Aura enabled. So up here we need to say Aura enabled. Even though we're not actually using Aura, this is the attribute you need to make it available in your JavaScript. So this is Aura enabled. And let's go ahead and deploy this class, which you can do by right-clicking in the class, which is nice, and say just deploy the one class to our Scratch org. Okay, cool. So that ran and completed successfully. And back in our JavaScript, we can import that controller. So in this case, let's call this, let's see, import the create lead method. That is what we called it, right? Create lead, yes. Import create lead from Salesforce, Apex, and this is the contact me controller. .create lead. So now we have access to the create lead function on the Apex controller. And we can call that inside our handler here. But the problem is we have nothing to give it for these parameters. So we need a first name, last name, company email, and description. All of those values are sitting in our HTML elements at this point. So we need to go back to our rendered callback. And if you remember how we got this dialog JavaScript variable from the dialog element, we need to do the same thing for each of the input elements so we can get the information from them. So we need variables for let's see, first name, last name, company, email, and description. So here we'll write the queries for them. We'll say this dot first name. What's this template? Query selector with a lowercase q this time. And we need to identify each of our HTML elements. Let's go see what we called those things. We didn't give them classes yet. So we're going to need to give them classes. The dialog has a class. That's how we reference it. So we'll say, oh, that's the label. We don't want to do the label. We need the input element. So we'll say class first name. Class last name. Class company. Class email. And one more for our text area. Let's put it in the front here. Okay. And again, a lot of times you would use IDs for this, but the Lightning Web Components, if you use an ID, that name, that ID might be substituted because the components don't know who their parents are. So a lot of times the IDs can be switched up. So you can't use IDs for selecting things in Lightning Web Components. So we're using classes instead. So we're going to say dot first name to grab our first name input, last name, query selector. And this is probably driving some of you nuts that I'm typing all of this out. So I will copy the last couple here. Last name, company, email, and of course the description. Okay, so that means we should have variables that represent each of these inputs and the text area. And we should be able to get their values from here and pass them to our create lead function, which is actually our Apex controller. Okay, so let's give them local variables for the values. So I'm going to say constant first name value. Let's give it a capital V. That looks a little better. This dot first name dot value. And once again, typing them all out. It's probably pretty aggravating for some of you. What do we got? 5 of these? There we go. Last name value. Last name value. Company. And email. And description. Okay, so now we have values for all of those, and we just need to create a little JSON object to pass the parameters to our Apex controller. So if we give it that JSON object notation, let's get these guys all wrapped up. I think that formatting looks a little bit better. And we'll say first name. I'm pretty sure that's how we name the parameters here. Yep, lowercase, first name, last name, company. Yep, that all looks good. And we'll map that to first name value. And then last name value, company value, email, value, of course, description. Okay, so that should call our Apex controller. Now, I'd love to test this in the LWC local development environment, but I have not been able to get Apex controllers to actually function in that environment. So we're going to have to put this into our, well, let's put it into our hero section. That's where the destination of this button is supposed to be, and then test it in Experience Builder in the preview of Experience Builder. So let's go add this to add this Contact Me button to our hero LWC, which I should probably go to the right folder. There we go. So in here, we have an existing button that does nothing. Let's get rid of that. And let's replace it with our Contact Me button. Now, if we preview our hero HTML, actually, I guess I can just go to the browser I already have open. Let's go to the home and hero. So there's our generated lady. There's the Contact Me button. And you see that it pops up our dialog. So at least we know that our new Lightning Web Component is nested in our hero web component. I'm not really sure why we're getting this centering there, but we're going to worry about the Apex controller functionality first, and we'll come back around and fix that. All right, so let's deploy this. SF project deploy start, just to get all of our files synced up to our Scratch org. Okay, and let's open our org. All sites as usual. Let's preview our site. So I click Contact Me, get my kind of wonky formatting. Now let's just put this in there. Well, yeah, that's fine. This isn't actually going anywhere. I would like to hire you. Wouldn't that be nice? And something went wrong. Description value is not defined. So we got an error because I have a typo, description. So let's go ahead and go fix that. One of the issues with typing everything out. That is likely in our JavaScript. So if I search for that bad name, there it is, descript. Well, if I just copy and paste from that, yeah, it's the same. Okay, so we're good. Let's push that. Deploy this source to org. Get that JavaScript fixed up. Try it again. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm actually not sure if you have to go back to build and refresh to get the right component, but that's what we're going to do. Actually, does this work? No. Yeah, we can't. We have to go to preview to get the button to actually function. Okay, so let's just do the autofill. I would like to hire and submit. And the dialog didn't go away, but let's go see if our lead was created. So let's go to, actually, let's not do it that way. That's tedious. I'm going to do it the Visual Studio way. Let's go to scripts and go down here to this built-in SOCL file. And let's see, let's select, well, let's select ID, that's fine. ID and name from leads. And if I select this and go to the command palette, I can say execute SOCL query with currently selected text. And we'll use the REST API. Okay, successfully ran. So we should see the output here. And we have one lead in our Scratch org, and it is my name, which is what we just put into that form. So the form is actually submitting to Apex. The problem is it's not going away afterward. So if I were to submit another one, I could say Joe Stevenson at Acme and submit that. And we go back and run this query again. Get rid of that. Select the line. I should get another lead. Okay, let's look at the second query run. And there it is, Joe Stevenson. So fantastic. Well, the leads are going through. But we want that form to go away, right? So let's close that output window again. And let's look at our JavaScript. So I think I know what's happening here. That's our HTML. There's our JavaScript. We handle submit and we prevent default, but we don't ever close the dialog. So what we want to do here is we could either call this.dialog close, or we could just call the close dialog function. I think I like the idea of calling the close dialog function so that if something does change every time we close a dialog, we get that when the form is submitted as well. So if I go in here and say close dialog, I think that's right. Oh, this.close dialog, of course. And deploy that source. We should get a nicer behaving form. Okay, let's go look at our experience builder. Let's refresh that guy. Preview. Okay. Timmy Two Legs. He also works at Acme. tt@acme.com. Good stuff. So if we submit it now, the dialog goes away because after submission, we've closed the dialog. And if we go back just to make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to, we can go back to our scripts down here and execute SQL and see that Timmy is in there. There he is, Timmy Two Legs. So we're generating leads off of our form that pops up in the Contact Me dialog. At that point, you can use any kind of workflows in the lead object to send emails to yourself, to send emails to the person who submitted the form, whatever you want to do. You have a million options at that point. Okay, let's see if we can do a couple of simple things to get this wonky form formatting under control. So let's go to our CSS for the Contact Me button. And that's not that guy. Here we go. So let's give ourselves as much space as possible here and open up our local development server. which has a Contact Me button. So if we open the file or the dialog up, we can see it's, super wonky. We probably want the input boxes to go more of the full width of the dialog. We probably want to make sure the dialog stays within a certain range. We want our labels to be left justified over the top of the inputs. We probably want some spacing between the labels and the text input that's above them. We likely want our submit and cancel buttons to be together in a little group. So let's get started. The first thing that I think will help will be to make each of these items the entire width. So let's go ahead and set their width to 100% of the container. And that should make us reload the dialog here. And sure enough, there we go. That looks a little bit better. You can see that because the submit button is an input and the cancel is a button, that the submit got picked up and made 100% and the cancel did not. So we'll have to deal with that in a minute. But this looks much better. So let's move on to aligning the labels to the left. So we can just do a label selector here. And we can say text align left. Save that. And that looks much better. Okay, next thing to fix, let's put a little bit of spacing. Let's say, let's add it to our labels. Let's give a top margin to our labels. There's a million ways to do all this stuff. Margin top. And let's just add 10 pixels of margin to each of our labels. That looks better. Looks like we could use one in the text area as well. Text area. Great, it's looking a little bit better. Let's address this issue with the buttons now. So we need to get these buttons aligned with each other and formatted on the same row and looking a little nicer. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the HTML of the Contact Me button LWC and put a div around the two buttons and then use CSS to operate on that. So the first thing, we go into our HTML for the Contact Me button LWC, and these are the two elements that represent our two buttons. We'll just we'll add a new div with a specific class. So we're going to say button container, btn container, and we'll put the two elements representing our buttons in there. Now, if we go to the CSS, let's that up. Okay, so now we're in the CSS for the form or the Contact Me form LWC. We can say dot button container, and let's select all the children, the two buttons from the button container, and let's give them each a width of 40%. So this will be 40% of the form, more or less. Okay, so that gave them good sizing. Now we want them to come up and be on the same row. So one way you can do that, let's grab the button container itself and say display flex. Now this should make the container try to put its children in a row if they can fit. And because our the children of this container are only 40% each, they should both fit on one row. And there we are. So they both put on one row. They don't look too great because they're stacked right next to each other on the left. So we can use another kind of flexbox command, justify content. And let's say space around, because we want a little bit of space in between, but we also want space on the sides. And there we go. So submit and cancel buttons, spaced apart a little bit nicer looking. Let's also give our container some margin. Looks like it's buttoned up against our text area a little bit. So we'll say margin top, and we have been giving everything 10 pixels. So let's stay consistent. And there we go. There's a little bit of space in between. Doesn't look amazing, but a lot better than where we started, and we can move forward. In the next video, we will give our users a little bit of feedback when they successfully submit a contact request. We will introduce a small sidebar or toast notification at the bottom of the screen when their submission has been received. It looks a little bit like this. Your request has been received at the bottom.